Imagine waking up before the sun rises, without an alarm clock, without a cell phone, without electricity. Imagine that the first thing you feel when you open your eyes is the bitter cold seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Imagine that your breakfast is still alive in the chicken coop, that the water for your bath is still frozen in the well, and that the workday ahead of you would be considered cruel by any modern labor law standards. Now imagine that you're not a tired adult trying to survive. You're a 6-year-old child, and this is simply the life you know. Welcome to the daily routine of families in rural America in the old days, a reality so distant from our own that it seems like fiction, but one that shaped the most powerful nation in the world and left marks that persist in American culture to this day. If you think your life is hard, wait until you discover what it really meant to live in the heart of America 200 years ago. The story I'm going to tell you today isn't about presidents, generals, or great battles. It's about ordinary people, entire families who woke up every day with a single goal in mind: to survive. And I'm not talking about surviving in the metaphorical sense we use today when we complain about a tough Monday at work. I'm talking about literally surviving, about making sure there would be food on the table, that winter wouldn't kill anyone from the cold, that diseases would be fought with homemade remedies made from herbs and prayers, because the nearest doctor was a 3-day horseback ride away. This was the reality of rural America, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, when pioneer families spread across the territory in search of land, opportunities, and the dream of a better life. The typical day for a rural American family began before dawn. The father was usually the first to rise, around 4 or 5 in the morning, depending on the season. He would light the fire in the fireplace or iron stove, which was the heart of the home. This fire could never go out because relighting it was a laborious process involving flint, steel, and a lot of patience. In some houses, the fire was kept burning continuously for months, sometimes years. The mother would wake up shortly after and begin preparing breakfast while the children were pulled from their straw or feather beds. There was no time for laziness. There was no concept of weekends or days off. Every pair of hands was needed for the farm to function, and that included the small hands of children. If you're enjoying learning these incredible details about American history, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. We bring fascinating stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss any of them. Breakfast was simple and practical. It usually consisted of corn or oat porridge, homemade bread, eggs when available, and sometimes salted pork that was preserved for months in barrels of salt. Coffee as a beverage only became popular later, so many families drank herbal teas, apple cider, or simply milk drawn from the cow that very morning. The meal was consumed quickly because there was work to be done, and the sun waited for no one. Tasks were rigidly divided among family members. The father and older sons took care of the heavy work in the fields, plowing the land, planting, harvesting, chopping firewood, mending fences, and caring for larger animals like horses and oxen. The mother and daughters took care of the house, the vegetable garden, the chickens, milking the cows, making butter and cheese, sewing, washing clothes, and cooking all the meals. There were no washing machines, there were no supermarkets, there was nothing ready-made. Absolutely everything had to be done by hand, from scratch, every single day. One task that consumed enormous amounts of time was making clothes. Poorer families grew their own flax or raised sheep to obtain wool. Then they had to spin the material into thread using spinning wheels, then weave those threads into fabric using homemade looms, then cut and sew that fabric into clothes. A single shirt could take weeks to complete. Children usually wore clothes handed down from older siblings, patched countless times until they literally fell apart. Shoes were a luxury that many children only knew in the harshest winter, and even then, a single pair had to last for years. Field work was brutal and relentless. There were no tractors, there were no harvesters, there was no modern machinery of any kind. Everything was done with animal power and human power. Plowing a single acre of land could take an entire day of exhausting work, pushing a wooden and iron plow while an ox or horse pulled from the front. The harvest was done grain by grain, ear by ear, under a scorching sun that showed no mercy. Men fainted from exhaustion. Children developed back problems from carrying weights inappropriate for their ages. Women worked until the last days of pregnancy and returned to work days after giving birth. There was no maternity leave, there was no health insurance, there was no safety net. Water was another constant challenge. There was no plumbing, there was no treated water running through faucets. Every drop of water used in the house had to be carried from a well, a stream, or a spring, sometimes hundreds of yards away. This was often the children's first task in the morning, grabbing buckets and fetching enough water for the day. And a lot of water was needed for drinking, for cooking, for washing dishes, for washing clothes, for giving to the animals. An average family might need to carry dozens of buckets per day, exhausting work that fell mainly to children and women. Lunch, when it existed as a separate meal, was usually the biggest meal of the day. It was when the family gathered briefly to eat something more substantial: meat stews with vegetables, breads, savory pies, beans slow-cooked for hours, and whatever was available in season. Meat was a luxury that depended on the time of year. In the fall, when pigs were slaughtered, there was plenty. By late winter and early spring, meat became scarce, and families depended more on grains, preserved vegetables, and eggs. Real hunger was not uncommon, especially when crops failed due to droughts, late frosts, or plagues. Children worked as much as adults, just to tasks suited to their size and strength. A 5-year-old already had responsibilities: collecting eggs, feeding chickens, scaring birds away from the crops, helping carry water. By 8 or 10 years old, a boy was already working alongside his father in the fields, and a girl already knew how to cook, sew, and care for younger siblings. Childhood as a period of play and carefree living simply didn't exist for most rural families. Children were seen as small adults in training, and their value was measured by the amount of work they could accomplish. This doesn't mean there wasn't love in families. On the contrary, family bonds were often extremely strong, forged by the need for cooperation for survival. Parents loved their children deeply, but that love was expressed in ways different from what we know today. Teaching a child to work hard, to be resilient, to survive in adverse conditions was the greatest expression of love parents could offer. A child who didn't learn these lessons would be doomed when they grew up and had to face the world on their own. If this story is captivating you and you want to know what the rest of the day was like for these families, how they had fun, how they educated their children, and faced life's toughest challenges in rural America, stay with me because we'll continue in the next chapter. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the perfect time to do so. The afternoon was devoted to continuing the work, with each family member fulfilling their assigned tasks. The sun was the only clock that mattered, and people worked as long as there was natural light. This meant workdays of 15 hours or more during summer, and shorter days in winter when the sun set early. But winter brought its own challenges: the extreme cold, the constant need to keep the fire burning, the difficulty of keeping animals fed when snow covered the pastures, the struggle to preserve enough food to last until spring. The kitchen was the center of all domestic activity. It was where the family gathered to eat, to warm up, to talk during the few moments of rest. The fireplace or iron stove dominated this space, always lit, always demanding attention. Cooking under these conditions was a complex art and dangerous one. There was no temperature control, there was no thermometer, there were no precise recipes. Women learned to cook by experience, developing an intuition about when the fire was too hot or too cold, when the bread was ready, when the stew needed more time. Burns were common, and fire accidents were one of the leading causes of death among women and children. Food preservation was a vital science that every family needed to master. Without refrigeration, without industrial canning, without any modern preservation methods, families relied on ancestral techniques: salting meat, smoking fish, drying fruits, fermenting vegetables, making pickles and vinegar, storing grains in barrels protected from rats and moisture. A family that failed at preserving food during fall would be doomed to starvation during winter. There was no second chance. There was no supermarket to come to the rescue. Nature did not forgive mistakes. Dinner was usually a lighter meal, consumed when the day's work finally ended and the family gathered around the fire. Leftovers from lunch, bread with butter, milk, sometimes a simple soup.
After dinner, there was a brief period of rest before bed when the family could finally relax a little. This was the time for small manual tasks that didn't require much attention. Women spun or sewed, men repaired tools, children could sometimes play. It was also the time for stories, for prayers, for the few moments of family connection that the exhausting day allowed. Sleeping was a very different experience than what we know today. Houses were small, often with only 1 or 2 rooms, and entire families slept together. Beds were often shared. Parents slept with young children, siblings slept together, sometimes even visitors or hired workers slept in the same space. Privacy as a concept simply didn't exist for most rural families. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers, or animal hair and needed to be regularly emptied and restuffed to prevent bug infestations.
When we think about the hard life of rural American families from the past, it's easy to imagine a gray and miserable existence without any kind of joy or entertainment. But that would be a completely wrong view. These people didn't just survive, they lived fully, finding happiness, love, fun, and meaning in ways that perhaps we have lost in our era of instant entertainment and immediate gratification. Life was hard, yes, but it was also deeply rich with authentic human experiences that connected people to each other and to the land they worked. Community was absolutely central to life in rural America. No family survived in isolation. Neighbors depended on each other in ways that are hard to imagine today. When a new family arrived in an area, the entire community gathered to help build their home in events called barn-raising bees. Dozens of men worked together for 1 or 2 days to erect the basic structure of a house or barn, while women prepared a large community meal. It was hard work, but it was also a celebration, an opportunity for socializing in an era when opportunities to meet other people were rare. Weddings were the most important social events of the year. A family with a daughter of marrying age prepared for months for the event, saving resources, preparing special food, sewing new clothes. The wedding itself was a celebration that could last for days, with music, dancing, abundant food, and a rare opportunity for young people in the community to meet. For many young people living on isolated farms, a neighbor's wedding was one of the few chances to meet potential partners. There was no dating app, there was no nightlife, there were almost none of the socializing opportunities we consider normal today. If you're enjoying this trip through time and want to keep discovering what life was really like during this fascinating era, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Religion played an absolutely central role in these families' lives. For most rural Americans of the past, faith wasn't just a part of life, it was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Sunday was the only day of rest, devoted entirely to religious observance. Families traveled for hours to reach the nearest church, sometimes covering distances we would consider absurd today. The church was much more than a place of worship. It was the social center of the community, the place where news was exchanged, business deals were made, marriages were arranged, and social cohesion was maintained. For families who lived too far from any church, religion was practiced at home. The father read the Bible aloud every night. The family prayed together before meals and before bed. Religious teachings were incorporated into every aspect of daily life. Faith was what gave meaning to suffering, what offered hope in the face of difficulties, what promised a better life after death for those who endured earthly trials with dignity and righteousness. Without this faith, it's hard to imagine how these families would have survived psychologically through the difficulties they faced. Education was a constant challenge for rural families. Formal schools were rare in the countryside, especially in frontier regions. When they existed, they operated only for a few months of the year, usually in winter, when farm work was less intense. A single teacher, often a young unmarried woman with little formal training, taught children of all ages in a single room. The curriculum was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and lots of Bible study. Materials were scarce, and many children learned to write on slate boards because paper was too expensive to be wasted on exercises. Many families couldn't spare their children even in winter months, and formal education took a back seat to survival needs. In these cases, mothers took on the responsibility of teaching the basics at home during the few hours of free time that remained after the day's work. Some children grew up illiterate. Others learned just enough to read the Bible and sign their own name. Higher education was a luxury accessible only to children from wealthier families who could send their young ones to academies in distant cities. Despite these limitations, the value of education was deeply respected by most families. Parents who had never had the opportunity to study dreamed of a different future for their children. America's promise, after all, was that each generation could live better than the one before, and education was seen as the path to realizing that dream. Books were precious treasures, carefully preserved and passed down from generation to generation. A family that owned half a dozen books was considered cultured and respected in the community. Diseases were a constant and terrifying reality for these families. Without antibiotics, without vaccines, without practically any modern medical knowledge, families lived at the mercy of diseases we consider trivial today. A simple infection could kill. A fever could take a child in a matter of days. Epidemics of smallpox, typhoid fever, cholera, and scarlet fever swept through entire communities, killing dozens of people in weeks. Families were large partly because infant mortality was extremely high. It was not uncommon for a woman to give birth to 10 or 12 children and see half of them die before reaching adulthood. The available remedies were a mixture of traditional knowledge, superstition, and hope. Medicinal herbs grown in the garden or collected from the forest were the first line of defense against disease. Homemade teas, poultices, ointments, and tonics were prepared by women who kept recipes passed down from mother to daughter over generations. Some of these remedies had real effectiveness, based on medicinal properties that modern science would later confirm. Others did nothing but offer psychological comfort, and some were genuinely dangerous, causing more harm than good. When home remedies failed, only prayer and hope remained. Trained doctors were extremely rare in rural areas, and when they existed, their knowledge was often little better than that of local healers. Medicine at the time still believed in practices like bloodletting and purging that often worsened patients' conditions. Many families preferred to trust in God and grandmother's remedies rather than call a doctor whose treatment was expensive and of dubious effectiveness. Death was a constant and accepted presence in these families' lives in a way that is difficult for us to understand today. Children grew up seeing siblings, cousins, neighbors, and friends die regularly. Family cemeteries, small fenced plots at the back of the property, were common parts of any farm. Grief was deep, but life had to go on. There was no time for prolonged depression when cows needed to be milked and the harvest waited in the field. This proximity to death shaped these people's worldview, making them both fragile and more resilient than we are today. If you made it this far, leave a like on the video because it really helps the channel grow and bring more amazing content like this to you. Fun, when it happened, was simple but deeply appreciated. Children played with handmade toys, rag dolls, wooden carts, balls made of sewn scraps, primitive bows and arrows. Games of hide-and-seek, tag, and imaginative play cost nothing and filled the rare moments of free time. In winter, when the snow covered the fields and work decreased, children could slide on makeshift sleds, skate on frozen lakes, and have snowball fights. Adults found entertainment in community gatherings, dances where fiddles and banjos played traditional music, harvest festivals where abundance was celebrated, skill competitions like target shooting, horse racing, and feats of strength. Alcohol, especially whiskey and hard cider, was an accepted part of these celebrations, and stories of the era suggest that rural Americans knew how to have fun when the opportunity arose. These parties were also opportunities for single young people to meet under the watchful eyes of their parents, beginning courtships that would eventually lead to marriage. Weddings were the most important social events of the year. A family with a daughter of marrying age prepared for months for the event, saving resources, preparing special food, sewing new clothes. The wedding itself was a celebration that could last for days, with music, dancing, abundant food, and a rare opportunity for young people in the community to meet. For many young people living on isolated farms, a neighbor's wedding was one of the few chances to meet potential partners.
There was no dating app, there was no nightlife, there were almost none of the socializing opportunities we consider normal today. If you're enjoying this trip through time and want to keep discovering what life was really like during this fascinating era, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Religion played an absolutely central role in these families' lives. For most rural Americans of the past, faith wasn't just a part of life, it was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Sunday was the only day of rest, devoted entirely to religious observance. Families traveled for hours to reach the nearest church, sometimes covering distances we would consider absurd today. The church was much more than a place of worship. It was the social center of the community, the place where news was exchanged, business deals were made, marriages were arranged, and social cohesion was maintained. For families who lived too far from any church, religion was practiced at home. The father read the Bible aloud every night. The family prayed together before meals and before bed. Religious teachings were incorporated into every aspect of daily life. Faith was what gave meaning to suffering, what offered hope in the face of difficulties, what promised a better life after death for those who endured earthly trials with dignity and righteousness. Without this faith, it's hard to imagine how these families would have survived psychologically through the difficulties they faced. Education was a constant challenge for rural families. Formal schools were rare in the countryside, especially in frontier regions. When they existed, they operated only for a few months of the year, usually in winter when farm work was less intense. A single teacher, often a young unmarried woman with little formal training, taught children of all ages in a single room. The curriculum was basic: read